Heyo, pedantic skeptic here. I am just making the intro and outro to a video response I did to Trent Horn, YouTube channel Council of Trent, about atheist double standards. And again, I blind reacted to the actual video. I'm just making the intro and the outro at a later date. That is kind of my new mode of working. It's not going to be every time, but sometimes what I'll do is I'll have the Bandicam running and I'll go through YouTube and click on some videos, because sometimes I'll make an intro to a video and of a response, and then I'll go respond, and the video that I'm responding to is utter crap. I've had that happen several times, so I figured it's more energy efficient to just blind react to the videos first, then make the intro and the outro after I've done the reaction. Trent Horn usually puts out some really good stuff. He's very respectful and very knowledgeable about a lot of things. He is honest, and I do appreciate his content. I disagree with him on things, obviously, but I think that he is one of the better YouTube apologists out there. He's very well-spoken, and he's very aware of his audience. So I do recommend people check him out. But we're going to respond to his video about atheist double standards, and I'm excited for this. Okay. Just checking my notifications. Let's do this.
Hey guys, welcome to the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist and speaker, Trent Horn. And today I want to talk about 5 atheist double standards. Now, I bring this up not to pick on atheists, but to raise the level of discourse. In fact, there are a lot of atheists online, people like the Real Atheology Crew, Majesty of Reason, people who want to raise the level of discourse. Well, Real Atheology are atheists, Majesty of Reason is more agnostic. But my point is that they also call out double standards. I've really seen other people, like Scott Clifton, for example. He'll call out other atheists. I love it also when I see atheists online that I enjoy interacting with, when they call out other atheists for engaging in arguments that have logical fallacy.
Yes, this is a good thing to acknowledge. I think that there are some atheists out there who are really shit at making points and arguments, and who we do need to call out for some of that shit. You know, the issue is that I'm not going to pander to my entire in-group and say, well, you know what, you're all just wonderful people. I think there are plenty of people who I have legitimate criticisms of, even if I agree with them on something.
Or for using double standards, the atheists they call out will say, you're just a Christian, you believe in a magical sky daddy. And they'll say, dude, I'm an atheist too, but I just don't use these bad arguments. And I feel the same way. I find there are Catholics who will use really bad arguments, and I want to say to them, hey, don't use these really bad arguments. We should put forward the best arguments on either side so that we can all raise the level of discourse. That would be a good thing to do, right? So that's just what I want to talk about today. 5 atheist double standards. Not saying every atheist does this. In fact, there are atheists I know who would say, yeah, definitely don't do these things. So let's start with the first one. Number 1 is the ancient document double standard. This is the idea that the Bible is treated as guilty until proven innocent. That the Bible is just different than any other kind of ancient literature. For example, if someone says, well, how do you know Jesus did this or that? To say, well, the Bible says, the Bible says. They'll say things like, you can't use the Bible to prove the Bible.
I agree with that. I will say that, we do need to be skeptical of any ancient documents. I'm not one to, I don't know that much about ancient documents. Anyway, it's not my wheelhouse, but I would say we do need to be very cautious how much stock we put in any ancient document. And we also need to be careful about, what exactly is claimed. Now, one of the things I will say is that because the Bible is written anonymously versus, other writings that we know who to attribute them to, we can definitely put some more stock into certain ancient documents, such as, the writings of Roman historians and things like that from the ancient times, because we know who the people that wrote that those stories actually were. And the other thing I will caution people about is when documents make mundane claims, you know, typical natural claims, that's quite a bit different than documents that make supernatural claims.
Now, in a sense, that's true. Like, you can't just use the Bible as a human document to say the Bible says God exists, the Bible is the Word of God, therefore God exists, or the Bible says it's the Word of God, therefore it's the Word of God. Right? That's a circular argument. You can't do that. So I see where they're coming from. If they mean you can't use the Bible to prove the Bible in a circular argument, yeah, they're right. But to say you can't use the Bible even to prove mundane historical facts, like that Jesus existed, Jesus called 12 disciples, he had a reputation for being a faith healer in Jerusalem and Galilee, he was crucified, people claimed to have seen Jesus after his crucifixion. And that's what's funny is people say to me, well, prove that Jesus rose from the dead without using the Bible. And I would say, well, why do I have to do that? Why? The Bible, quotation marks, is a collection of ancient documents. If I'm going to prove anything about Jesus or the origins of Christianity, shouldn't I use the documents that were written by those people? It doesn't mean I believe them. Like when I converted to Christianity, it's not because I read the Bible and said, oh, Jesus rose from the dead because the Bible says so. Rather, I looked at the Bible as a set of historical documents, said they could have true things, might have false things, and sifted through them to find the most basic facts I can pull from them. That'd be Jesus's life, his death by crucifixion, and the followers who claim to see him alive after his death. And so what I would just ask atheists is, look, treat the Bible like you treat any other ancient historical document. Give it a chance. There could be true things, there could be false things in it. What are the standards you will use to determine if something is true or not?
The only thing I would add is you have to remember that the Bible does make the claim that it is the written word of an infallible, all-powerful, all-knowing God. And so when the Bible gets things incorrect, well, then that whole claim about the Bible is out the window. And, I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater, but what I'm saying is, be careful. There are documents where, the author is known, and so not only can you put more stock in them because you know that it's written by somebody who's perfectly fine putting their name to something, you know that there might be some contexts, like if that person's a known satirist or if that person's a known fraud, you can say, well, we shouldn't trust these documents because we know that this particular person set out to write things that weren't true for one reason or another, versus somebody whose job it was, to record like mundane everyday life, like, okay, so-and-so died today, so-and-so had a baby, blah, blah, blah.
One standard that's used that would amount to a double standard is to say, well, I'll believe whatever is in the Bible that is confirmed by another ancient document. It's a kind of corroboration test. So in order to believe something happened in the Bible, prove it with something else outside of the Bible that confirms it. Otherwise, I'm not going to believe that.
I will also add that, it doesn't necessarily have to be a document. There are plenty of things that happened in the Bible that, they would be, geographic or, maybe even biological evidence for, such as, if there was a global flood, we would expect to, see a certain worldwide deposition of, various things from, the exact same point in time, several thousand years ago, and we don't see that. Or, what was it, the parting of the Red Sea, we would expect to find probably some sort of disturbance on the seabed or something like that, because this stuff didn't happen so long ago that, the evidence would be wiped away by now.
But by that logic, if you use Tacitus or Josephus, the ancient Roman and Jewish historian, Tacitus is Roman, Josephus is Jewish.
I'm pretty sure those two just wrote about what Christians believed rather than what actually happened.
To prove the Bible, then what outside sources confirm Tacitus and Josephus? What outside sources?
So I haven't heard anybody actually ask that. I think that, that particular question would be a little bit redundant and a little bit ridiculous. How much verification do you need, especially given how old some of this stuff is and how many documents might still be around. But, again, Tacitus and Josephus wrote mostly about the group of people who called themselves Christians and what they believed, rather than actual historical events.
Confirm their outside sources. You'd be caught in an infinite regress. And in fact, Pope Leo XIII, at the end of the 19th century, he made this observation related to this double standard. He wrote, "A profane book or ancient document is accepted without hesitation, whilst the scripture, if they only find in it a suspicion of error, is set down with the slightest possible discussion as quite untrustworthy." So the Bible is guilty until proven innocent. But other ancient historians are innocent until proven guilty. Now, some people say, well, it's different. The Bible talks about miracles, so it's not trustworthy. But a lot of ancient historians also talk about miracles as well.
I hope he gives us an example.
But you don't throw them out either. Instead, we should go through all of them and see which events, natural and supernatural, are most likely to have actually occurred.
I mean, the other thing I wanted to quickly say is that the decision to believe in God or not shouldn't hinge solely or even in a large part on the veracity of ancient documents and whether or not, verification for those particular claims exists. I think that there should be a lot better things out there than just, what a bunch of people thousands of years ago may have witnessed.
Are the descriptions of the events mere hearsay? Do they have a direct connection to an eyewitness, for example, like Paul, who testified to seeing the risen Jesus and then went and spoke to other people who had seen the risen Jesus as well? People who were willing to die for that belief to show their sincerity of it?
Okay, just a quick thing. The fact that somebody is willing to die for something that they sincerely believe doesn't have anything to do with whether or not that thing is true.
So that's what I would say is don't treat the Bible, or to say that someone using the Bible to demonstrate even a minimal historical fact about Jesus, don't just write it off as using the Bible to prove the Bible. Treat the Bible like you treat other ancient documents and just see what are the most basic facts you can take from them. And with the Bible, I would say, well, what explains these basic minimal facts about the origin of Christianity? Why did a bunch of people come to believe that a crucified rabbi had risen from the dead and was God incarnate? Why did they believe that?
I don't fucking know. I mean, people believe all sorts of weird shit. There are cargo cults out there. When, in World War II, somebody brought, to some island a bunch of food and shit like that. People were like, oh my god, this is, God, and they started worshiping the idea that ship would come back. I mean, people do all sorts of weird shit.
Because it happened is a very good explanation for all of those facts. Let me talk about another double standard related to this one. I call it the Spider-Man objection. It goes like this. If an atheist...
Is this the, because the Bible lists, is it the idea that, calling the Bible true because it lists real places would be like calling Spider-Man true because it lists real places?
Atheists will sometimes say, well, the Bible's not reliable. Here's all these errors in it. And they'll point out all of these errors. Even the presence of a few errors. Oh, it's not reliable.
Whether or not it's reliable is one thing. Whether or not it's the, infallible written word of an all-knowing God is a different matter.
Can't trust the Bible because it's unreliable. But if you show how reliable the Bible is, like if you walk through the book of Acts and say, well, look, Acts of the Apostles gets a lot of really obscure historical and geographical facts correct, things that only someone in that particular time and place would have known.
And that's fine. There can be, portions of the Bible where the authors, were more or less attuned to the culture and the area they were living in. Nobody's objecting to that.
That helps us to give an early date for it, to talk about authentic authorship related to it. If you look at all of these things that the Bible gets right, what you'll hear is, so what? Spider-Man comics get a lot of things about New York right. It doesn't mean Spider-Man existed. So it's heads I win, tails you lose. If the Bible has errors, it's not true. If the Bible gets a ton of things right, so what? So do Spider-Man comics.
The difference here is what exactly the Bible gets right. Every claim of the Bible should be treated independently. We shouldn't be playing this game of, well, there are, a couple of things in the Bible that we know to be untrue, and a couple of things in the Bible that we know to actually have happened. Therefore, everything else in the Bible that we aren't sure about must have happened because maybe there are more things in the Bible that actually happened correctly, as depicted, than things that were inaccuracies. I don't think we should be playing the game. I think we should be seeking to independently verify every claim made by an ancient document, including the Bible.
There's nothing the Bible can do in order to prove that it's accurate unless it's corroborated by every other ancient document, which is not how ancient sources work. In fact, Josephus and Tacitus, they missed important events. They didn't describe the Emperor Claudius expelling the Jews from Rome in AD.
Well, part of the problem there is that these people lived way after the Bible was written, and they were just writing about Christianity in general.
AD 41. That was a huge event. They didn't record it. They missed it. But the Bible got it right. Luke did in Acts chapter 18. So that shows that Pope Leo's observation is still proven today. And of course, the important thing to remember is that we know Spider-Man is fiction because the creators of the comics have told us it's fiction, whereas the New Testament authors assert that this is something that really did happen in history. And Spider-Man's deeds, if they really did happen, would be covered by a bunch of other news sources and things like that. Whereas in the ancient world, there were not as many writers writing.
So my only rebut to that is that the argument is generally, let's fast forward, several thousand years into the future where, maybe, unless it made national news, a lot of local news isn't going to archive and save every last news story. It would just take up way too much storage space if every day of the news, from a local station was saved. It's a matter of, after enough time, something's going to get deleted, and, after enough generations, people aren't going to remember, oh, there was a news story about some guy shooting webs out of his fingers and running around. And that is, I don't I don't think it's the best comparison either, but I think that you should do a little bit of a better job presenting what that actual comparison is in its entirety.
Writing about things. And Jesus wasn't flying around Jerusalem like how Spider-Man web slings around New York City. He was a faith healer, an exorcist. His most amazing miracle was rising from the dead. And when he did that, he only appeared to his disciples and to an enemy of the church, Paul. And we have the testimony we would expect if Jesus did appear to those people. All right, here's...
Wait, how... If Jesus is the only person who did those things and rose from the dead, how do we have any expectation of what it should look like for somebody to be rising from the dead and appearing to people?
Double standard number 2. Saying that God is evil, but then saying there is no such thing as evil.
Wait, I am, not sure, what you mean by that.
I want to share with you 2 quotes from Richard Dawkins, the author of the God.
Oh, geez. You can't use Richard Dawkins as, a placeholder for any other atheist.
God delusion. Here's the first quote about the Bible. So, Dawkins writes, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." In other words, Richard Dawkins says, the God of the Bible is evil, as if it's a fact. The God of the Bible is evil. Not just Dawkins' opinion of the matter, because Christians would say, no, he's not evil. He's the greatest thing since sliced bread. He would say, what are you talking about? Just read the things that God has done in the Bible. Clearly, he is evil because he has done things that are objectively evil. Ethnic cleansing, killing of infants, things like that. These things, it's just a fact that they're evil. But then here's another quote from Richard Dawkins. "The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference."
Okay. I believe these are 2 separate books. Let me just go back for a sec. Yeah, this is The God Delusion, and then... Hang on, where were we? And then...
Nothing but pitiless indifference.
This is River Out of Eden. Two separate books. Now, regardless, you have to read the quotes again, because Dawkins outlines a character in a book, and describes a character as evil in a conceptual way, and then says we would expect that the universe has none of these things. So, my analysis of this is that the claim isn't that there is evil. The claim is that evil as a concept can apply to one character in a book, but not to the entire universe. I'm not getting the impression that he's both saying evil exists and evil doesn't exist at the same time. You gotta remember he doesn't believe in God, so when he's saying the God of the Bible, he's talking about the God of the Bible as a fictional character in a book, not as a real entity. You gotta do better than this.
So on the one hand, it's just a fact that God is evil because he does evil things. But on the other hand, if these actions take place in the universe, like someone committing genocide or committing infanticide, this isn't evil. If God does not exist and infants are killed or entire races are wiped out, that's just nature. That's just atoms in motion. It's nothing but pitiless indifference we see in the universe. No evil, no good. We live in a materialist universe. So you see here the double standard of quickly wanting to say it's a fact that God is evil or Christians are evil. But then when we talk about the universe itself, we can't say certain things are objectively good or objectively evil.
You kind of answered your own concern here is objective, but the capacity to deem something as evil versus evil as an actual entity or evil as, a noun versus an adjective are different. And I think that's what these quotes were getting at, not necessarily, using the word in the same form both times. Just be careful of that. Be careful how you're reading into things, especially when somebody is listing attributes of a character they don't believe in. They're not asserting it as though those things apply to anything real.
Because then we would ask, well, what is evil? One definition of evil that I like is something is evil when it's not the way it is supposed to be.
How do we know what something is supposed to be? We could get into a huge, long, deep dive into, how things are quote-unquote supposed to be, but we're not going to do that.
You can't just say, well, evil is suffering. Okay, well, there can be suffering that's not evil. Like when a dentist drills a cavity, that's not evil. It's a good thing he's doing to help me, even though it hurts. And people can commit evil acts without causing suffering. I've asked atheists, is it evil for someone to fantasize about molesting children?
That's a good question. So I would say no. The things that happen inside of your head that don't actually translate to actions aren't necessarily anything other than thoughts that are happening in your head. Acting on certain thoughts, your actions are what we need to deem as good versus evil. Your thoughts, on the other hand, are things that are, more or less out of your control and aren't going to actually materialize, hopefully, into something that harms another person.
If he never acts on it. And a lot of them have said, no, it's not evil. They've said you can't have evil if there's no suffering. And I would say, no, most people would think those are evil thoughts.
I would say they're bad thoughts to have. I would say that, genuinely fantasizing about that isn't good, isn't moral. Whether I would call it evil, you'd have to give me a really good definition of evil.
So that's not right. But if evil are just the way things are not supposed to be, and goodness are the way things are supposed to be, that assumes a lot of teleology or a goal or purpose of the universe that makes sense under theism, but not under atheism. Now, some people might say, when the problem of evil comes up, they'll say, look, this is just an internal critique. I'm just saying that you as a Christian, you believe in good and evil. You believe in objective good and objective evil. Well, guess what? Under your standards, God is evil. All right, so even under your standards, he's evil, even though I don't believe in good and evil. Now, I think that this option is put forward when the double standard is pointed out, because I don't think Richard Dawkins is saying Christians should believe that God is evil. He's just saying that it is a fact that God is evil. But more problematic is that if this is an internal critique, when atheists propose this, I can come back and say, all right, well, you're not saying God is evil. You're just saying my worldview is inconsistent. That if I'm saying these actions are evil and God does them, that would make God evil as well. I could just say, well, when God performs certain actions, it's not evil for God. It's not inconsistent. It might be wrong for me to kill someone because I didn't give them their life. I'm not the author of life like God is. But God created the whole universe. He created everyone. And he has the right to give us as long or as little life as he desires because he is the author of life. And a lot of atheists, when I put forward, they'll say, oh, no, that's still evil. God wouldn't have the right to do something like that. And so,
I mean, I would beg to differ with that. I think that, if something is powerful enough to do that, then it's powerful enough to give itself the right to do that. And, it doesn't really matter what we think of it either way. But, that still doesn't get us to whether or not this being actually exists.
So at this point, I'll say, even if I make my system internally consistent with the moral rules, you'll just come back and say, well, I reject those moral rules, or I reject that idea God could be the author of life, things like that. So ultimately, I would say they do believe in moral law. Many will believe in objective morality, objective good, objective evil. They'll believe in that when they are offended by something God did in the Bible or something that a Christian has done.
I mean, yeah, I personally don't think we should be, nitpicking things that happened in the Bible to say anything about the character of God and whether or not God is real, because, a character can be real and do some really fucked up shit.
And so they'll just factually say something is good and something is evil. But then when pressed to define good and evil and explain the source of these objective moral norms, it becomes a lot more problematic. I want to share with you also a quote from Luke, I think his name is Luke Muehlhauser. I don't know if he's written on atheism in a while. He had a really good website called Common Sense Atheism. I remember reading it long time ago, probably like 10 years.
Be careful relying on memory, especially from 10 years ago, to relay anything, this important.
Years ago. And wrote a lot on philosophy of religion, apologetics, and he talks about how atheists ridicule religious people for believing in God because it just seems like God exists, while also believing in moral realism, or the idea that moral truths, that raping people is always evil, like that's just an objective fact, that these moral truths, they just exist out there, they're a part of the universe. And believe that for atheists who believe in moral realism, some of them can be inconsistent or have a double standard in this regard. I'm going to read to you what he wrote. I found this really fascinating. He writes, many atheists seem to think moral realism is obvious.
I don't even know what moral realism is.
And easy to prove. I disagree. Consider the claim we moral realists are making. We generally claim there are invisible properties in the world not detectable by our usual tools of science. Properties of an entirely different sort than the usual is facts of science. There are mysterious ought facts, and there is great disagreement about what they are or how we know them. Now that is a strong claim, an extraordinary claim, we might say. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? He then goes on to point out the double standard. He says, do those arguments look familiar? They should. They are the exact same arguments atheists reject when they are given for the existence of God. Atheists are skeptical of these arguments when given for the existence of God, but they are credulous and gullible towards these arguments when you replace the word God with another mysterious thing called moral truths. It would be hypocritical of me to reject subjective experience and popular consensus as evidence for God, while at the same time accepting subjective experience and popular consensus as evidence for moral realism.
I would agree with that.
All right, here's double standard number 3. Bad Christians are evidence against Christianity. Bad atheists don't prove anything.
Again, that's not something I've ever heard anybody use. You're gonna have to give me an example. I'm having a hard time understanding what this exactly is.
I used to read the Patheos blog, the Atheism Patheos blog, before it became the Atheism Patheos non-religious blog. I would go there and try to find different arguments or reflections, and it was interesting. It was interesting to look at. But I eventually got sick of it because on a lot of these atheistic blogs, they got really repetitive. Most of the entries were, look at this bad Christian who stole money from his church. Look at this bad Christian who molested people. This
I would need to see exactly where that claim goes. If the claim is something like, being a Christian doesn't necessarily make you a good person, that would be, reasonable. But if it's actually claiming Christianity can't be true because this one Christian did X, Y, and Z, then of course I would say, well, that's a bunch of bullshit. You can't determine the truth value of something based on the actions taken by a person who accepts that X is true. I would agree that that would be, ridiculous.
bad Christian, that bad Christian. Okay, well, if there's tens of millions of Christians, you're bound to find some that are hypocrites or that have moral failings.
Again, every group, every demographic that there could ever be, you're going to have some people in that demographic who are absolutely unsavory, immoral, improper, whatever word you want to use for somebody who does things that are objectively harmful to other people. Yes.
But it's really hard to find a hypocritical atheist. The only
No, it's not.
kind of hip because what atheists will say, if I point out a bad atheist, you'll say, well, what about that scandal a few years ago about atheistic conferences having to make the attendees sign statements promising they won't sexually harass the women there?
Yeah, that's a problem. I'm not arguing that.
Because that was a really big problem in atheist conferences. I've never had to sign anything like that at a Christian conference, but apparently that was a big problem at atheist conferences a while back. People say, well, that's not hypocrisy because atheism doesn't say anything about morality. It doesn't say anything about how people will behave. It just says there's no reason to believe God exists. So, yeah, it's hard. I would rather be a Christian who fails in Christian morality than be a non-hypocritical atheist because atheism doesn't have any particular moral stances. You could be a humanist, you could be a nihilist. There's all different kinds of atheists in that regard. So I just think that's, it's not very fair to want to point out, here are these bad Christians. Obviously, that shows that Christianity is bad.
I mean, I would agree that that would be a stupid thing to say. And I think that, it doesn't say anything about the truth of Christianity.
Well, there are also bad atheists. Can you make an argument? And I wouldn't use that to try to show there's an argument that atheism is bad. Just there's going to be bad people in every kind of belief system. This also works in the other direction, though, because if atheists say, well, bad atheists don't say anything about atheism because atheism has nothing to do with particular moralities, then you can't go in the opposite direction and say.
So I just want to quickly mention that a lot of these things about like good and bad people in these demographics are usually used to make claims about whether or not you're, following or believing these particular things has any influence on your behavior. And so, if I were to make the claim that, your religious belief really has nothing to do with how you act towards other people, and I could point out, all sorts of things about, how many people in each, how many people who have been convicted of X, Y, Z, all the way through, however many different, crimes there could be are, in religious demographic A, B, C, D, whatever. And, point out that, like, hey, look, Christians make up this percentage of the population, the general population. They also make up the same percentage of people who have been convicted of, theft, murder, whatever. And that was used to back up my claim that the religion you follow or the God you believe in doesn't, on average or in general, have an impact on your behaviors. That would be a sound claim because I've brought forth evidence of, these people are self-identifying Christians and they have been convicted of whatever. and the percentage of people who are in the general public who identify as Christians is, I think it's what, like 68% in America now, and like the prison population is whatever percent Christian. Um, and the closer those two percentages are, the more evidence I have for the claim that being a Christian doesn't affect your behavior. For example, and it's a very complicated thing. But yes, if I were to say, you know, I know that when it comes to like sex offenders, 93% are Christians. From the last surveying of that. And whether or not some people were just lying about that or not, doesn't matter. There's a margin of error for that reason. But if I were to use that to say, maybe Christianity isn't the best way to stop people from touching children, that would be one thing. But if I said this means that Christianity can't be true, that would be, really a nonsense claim. It wouldn't have any, it wouldn't be backed up by what is actually being presented.
Say, look at this brilliant atheistic scientist, or look at this really reasonable atheistic philanthropist. Aren't they great? Aren't they such great examples of reason unchained from religion? It's very subtle that happens, but pointing out very virtuous atheists, if you do that as a way to try to show, oh, look what real atheism can do.
I mean, I don't criticize atheists any less than I criticize a Christian. Like I have, a lazy, fat, loud roommate who's an atheist who I can't really stand, and it's not, I'm not gonna let him get away. I mean, I don't bother him about some of his shit, but I don't like hand wave it away just because he happens to be atheist. I, hold him to the same standard of judgment at least that I'd hold anybody else to. I have friends who are atheists, and they're lazy. They, aren't very smart, and I love them to death. But I wouldn't rely on them for anything overly important. No offense to them if they're watching this, but I wouldn't, you know, be any less irritated if they did something shitty.
I feel like if you do that, even subtly, you're doing the inverse. You're saying, well, yeah, bad atheists don't prove anything, but look at these great atheists. Look at Carl Sagan. Look at Neil deGrasse Tyson, though I know he's more of an agnostic and people have mixed feelings about him.
Because he has allegations of sexual misconduct. Was it Lawrence Krauss or someone else who also? No, I don't think it was Lawrence Krauss. Or was it? I can't remember. Um, but I don't know where Trent Horn here kind of draws the line with Christians. And I'm not going to accuse him of being, there are conservatives, especially conservative Christians, who will like fight tooth and nail to defend somebody who's on their side who they really like, despite allegations of horrible shit. And you know, I do know that a lot of people on the left and people who are secular are very quick to denounce people who are on their side who do shit like that. So, and I'm not saying that he wouldn't denounce somebody who happens to be Christian or Catholic who does something bad, but I don't see as much in the atheist community of this. Hey, we have somebody in our community who we know like raped somebody or whatever. We don't like them anymore. A lot of people are dismissive of Richard Dawkins now because of some of his transphobic comments. I just think the guy's an ass. But I do see a lot of conservatives, still standing by people who have done atrocious shit. And that's a problem. And I think that, I'm sure the two of us would agree that, that is a bad thing to have happen, to see people do. So, yeah.
So sorry, if the bad atheists don't disprove atheism, the good atheists don't really show anything about the virtues of atheism.
I agree.
Either. That's also why I don't rely on the testimony of the saints as a major proof for Christianity. Rather, I would use those testimonies as an opportunity to ask a question. Wow, what really motivated these people to these amazing acts of holiness? And then for us to dig deeper, because there's other bad Christians as well. Oh, and good and bad Christians. When there's a really good atheist, people will sometimes say, well, their free thinking is what makes them so good, and they'll tie the virtue into atheism. But if you bring up a really, really good Christian, someone like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, people will say, well, Christianity didn't make them good. They would have been good anyways, even if it weren't for religion.
Yeah, I agree that I don't generally see people do that. I haven't seen that really ever, but if people do that, that is a problem. They shouldn't be doing that. I agree.
And some people even say that they were good in spite of religion. Christopher Hitchens said about Martin Luther King Jr., in no real, as opposed to nominal sense, then, was he a Christian. So Hitchens denied that Martin Luther King Jr. was a real Christian because he didn't act.
I mean, I think if Hitchens had said something like he wasn't a biblical literalist, that would be a different, conversation altogether. But I agree. Sometimes people word things poorly, and it's a problem.
Act in the ways that the ancient Israelites acted, for example. But I think clearly, and other atheists will agree with this, that there are people who are very good, who are Christian, who if they had not become Christian, their lives might have been very different in that regard. Now, the only time I'm willing to tolerate something that resembles this double standard would be if an atheist argued this way. Look, if Christianity were true, we would expect people to be moved by grace, to be good and not commit grievous sins.
I mean, again, I would say more along the lines of if Christianity made people act good, or if Christianity made people behave in a way that's, congruent with people being healthy and safe and happy and things like that, then we would expect, every Christian to, not be like, ever on the sex offender registry, ever murderers, ever, thieves, and, things like that. I think that both of us would agree that, at the end of the day, your actions aren't a direct result of your beliefs. I think it's dangerous to profile people as they're going to act a certain way because they believe a certain thing. Because beliefs and thoughts and actions are different things.
But if atheism is true, we would not expect atheists to have any kind of grace or supernatural help to be more moral than other people. So it's okay to point out immoral Christians, but not immoral atheists. So if it is at least phrased this way, okay, I see where you're coming from, all right? If it's just lazy, like, look at all these awful Christians, ah, ha, 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 and it's just a kind of a gotcha moment, well, that's lazy thinking. And then that leads to the lazy reply when it comes to pointing out bad atheists. So I will say this argument, it's called the meager moral fruits argument. As a Christian, I would offer other reasons then as to why we would expect there to be some really bad Christians, and we wouldn't necessarily expect Christians in given areas to always be more moral than atheists.
Now, the other thing I wanted to quickly mention here is, I've said it a few times, but like, there is a common atheist, argument about like, we shouldn't expect Christians to act morally because if they sincerely believed in, salvation before they die, like, you can do whatever you want as long as you believe enough and say sorry to God, you're going to get forgiven and go to heaven anyway. There are people that say that. I've said it a few times. I haven't said it in a serious way. I've said it more in a, well, I could make the argument, blah, blah, blah. I don't make that argument because I think that human behavior is a little bit more complex than just, oh, I can get away with whatever I want if I, say sorry enough to God. I think people are not that simplistic in what motivates their behavior. I think that people who do genuinely argue that point, though, need to re-examine some of the things that they're saying. I think that is a poor argument for, any type of action regarding Christianity.
For a variety of reasons, but mere moral fruits argument, an argument for another time. Once again, on both sides, don't focus on the bad elements of each side. What are the best elements, the best people and the best arguments?
My thing is, why is it really that important? If somebody does something fucked up, why does it matter if they're a Christian, Muslim, atheist, Buddhist, whatever?
Let's judge them on their merits. All right, double standards number 4 and 5. Number 4, ridiculing Christian censorship, but excommunicating atheistic heretics.
Wait, I don't understand what he means by that. Ridiculing Christian censorship.
So you recall before that when you point out bad atheists, people will say, "Oh, well, that even if that atheist was a sex offender or a really bad person, that doesn't disprove atheism because atheism has nothing to do intrinsically with morality. There's atheists with all different kinds of morality. They'll say atheism is just about, it's only about lack of belief in God or that God does not exist. That is what atheism is only about." And they will then sometimes ridicule Christians who in the Middle Ages, excommunicate people. Heretics are exiled. People are treated as heretics, excommunicated. There's no freedom of thought in Christianity. You have to sign dogmatic, like at a college, you have to sign a statement of faith. And if you deviate from that, you'll be fired. You're a heretic. That Christianity has to have thought police to make sure everyone thinks the same way, whereas atheists are free thinkers. But I think that's actually a big double standard because especially recently, in the past few years, you have cases of atheists imposing secular liberal dogma far beyond the mere claims that there's no evidence for God or something like that. Two examples of this. One would be Stephen Woodford from Rationality Rules. He had a controversy, I say it was a year or two ago, it was a little while ago, where he was denounced by the atheist community of Austin.
Oh yeah, this was about his trans people in sports rant that he posted to YouTube. So real quick, for those of you who aren't aware, he took the position that trans people should not be in sports because the fact that they were assigned a different gender at birth means that they may have some advantage over people who are cis, especially if it's, male to female. And I have friends who kind of, we have conversations about this where, you know, there's a difference between, a trans woman who began transitioning pre-puberty and post-puberty, and how like the body changes. One of the things that I will say, just knowing how biology works, is that humans are not so sexually dimorphic that the sex you're born with, on average, has a great effect on your physical abilities. Regardless of what sex you're born with, you're still going to have to work your ass off and train to be an athlete. And not to be crude or anything, but like this is what the average trans person in America looks like. Do these people look particularly athletic to you? Does this person look athletic to you? Like, this person could jump over something or run for any length of time. I mean, this is fucking America, where 2/3 of us are fucking overweight, and being trans does not guarantee you're going to be athletic in any way. And I think that Rationality Rules was incorrect with some of his assumptions about how trans people operate. I think that he had this idea that everybody who's a trans athlete has been not only assigned the opposite gender at birth and stayed in that opposite gender until they completed their training and then decided to transition. Like there was an episode of South Park about this. Generally people who are trans athletes transitioned very young. They knew for a very long time that they were trans, and they still have to go through the various processes of, training and, qualifying and everything else that cis people do. And so I think, the issue of trans people in athletics is, ridiculous as far as, one, trans people aren't necessarily super common in athletics unless we're talking about, like middle school sports where, you're throwing a ball around or running in circles. And like, do people really give a shit who wins when, I mean, like, it's just ridiculous.
Here in Texas, because Woodford posted videos where he questioned the fairness of transgender women competing with biological women.
Again, the average trans woman is not an athlete, okay? And people who are trans women still, like a cis woman, have to train. Now, the thing is, we can get into the nitty-gritties of, well, maybe that trans woman has an easier time building muscle. And, the thing is, how are we quantifying that? I mean, come on. Are we really going to say that, because somebody may, take a couple of months less to build the same amount of muscle, that means they have an unfair advantage? Because you'll see that same amount of variation within biological females. It's not just, if you're a biological male and you identify as a female and now you're a trans woman, you automatically have an advantage.
So biological males who identify as women competing against biological women in athletics, he questioned whether that was fair and gave arguments against that. And against that, the ACA said that he was transphobic. They denounced him, weren't going to have anything to do with him. And he replied to that.
So, I wouldn't go as far as to say he's transphobic, because his language, for the most part, there were a couple of things that I took objection to. He said something about, X and Y chromosomes. That's not the only determination of your biological sex. And that sounds like a little bit of a nitpick, but if you're going to speak on these issues, you should have some good information about, where these things are, what is true about these things. But, he was pretty respectful in how he talked about people. He didn't, use any slurs. He didn't, say that these people were invalid and things like that. He was simply, saying, we need to make sure that if somebody, may have an advantage, that they don't actually have an advantage. I think that it's a little bit of a moot point because, to some degree, people who are inclined towards athleticism have some inherent advantage anyway, just because of their inclination. And, there's enough variation between, within each sex that, it's not like a trans woman is going to be, full of testosterone and rage and, having, 8 times the muscle bulk of a cis woman. That's just not the way it works.
There's a lot of atheists who will say that, on one hand, no, atheism is just about the lack of evidence for the existence of God. But then they'll denounce other atheists for espousing views that they'll say are wrong, views that you can't hold. You can't be a good atheist.
So, I know some atheists who are transphobic to some degree. I mean, not there are different degrees of being transphobic. Okay, you can be, mildly transphobic where, I know people who are, saying only passing trans people are valid, and, that's less transphobic than, something like, everybody who identifies as trans deserves to be, forced in conversion camps or, worse. So, I mean, those are both transphobic things to say, but one is less transphobic than the other. I know plenty of people who I know a few people who identify as atheists who also have some prejudices against trans people and are, transphobic. And so being atheist doesn't necessarily mean you're trans affirming at all. It doesn't have anything to do with it. Just because, and the reason why most atheists are trans affirming is because most objections to people being trans come from religious ideology. And because you're free of that religious ideology, you have no particular reason to take issue with somebody identifying with a different sex than what they were born with.
If you hold these views, this has happened with Richard Dawkins as well. That Dawkins has said things and things that are awful, things that maybe I would agree with, and even things that I wouldn't necessarily agree with. And atheists have denounced him, say that he's misogynistic, that he's transphobic, and say that they don't want to have anything to do with him. We're not going to have him at a conference. Don't read his books. Sounds a lot like Christians. Where for these atheists, it's not just lack of belief in God. They're also enforcing a secular liberal ideology that you must hold to. And if you don't agree with it, there will be consequences for you.
So I think what he's trying to say here is that, the atheist community at large claims to only be about one thing, but then, because the majority of them have some agreements on other things, they tend to band together, even though they say they don't do that. I think that's what he's trying to say. And so my response to that is, you know, I tend to judge people independently of how other people are judging them. And there are things that I find acceptable and there are things I don't find acceptable. Um, I get into, I, I'm politically left, and I would say that I'm very liberal about a lot of things, but I get into arguments with people who are also left and liberal and things like that, religious or otherwise, over things like, is obesity a choice? Is, it reasonable to expect people to, you know, take certain actions to protect themselves? And I'm not talking about like victim blaming stuff. I'm just talking about like, you know, how responsible should we be, during a pandemic? How responsible should we be, with, just some of the actions we take? How much should we be policing drugs and blah blah blah? And do we have a duty to protect each other from making stupid decisions? And I get into arguments all the time about some of these things with people who, on other topics, I would, agree with. And I think that, in a lot of ways, cancel culture has kind of gotten out of control because there are ways to have disagreements with people without completely denouncing them. And so, yeah, I agree that there are some problems there.
Even things like a kind of secular excommunication. So they should be aware of that. If they try to ridicule Christians for doing that, a lot of atheists do the same thing. Instead, we should all be free to put the best ideas out there and test them. All right, here is the last one, the last double standard. It's okay to criticize Christians, but it's not okay to criticize Muslims.
Um, I'm going to assume he means the actual like religion of Christianity versus the religion of Islam. If I'm criticizing a Christian, it's probably not because they're Christian. I'm probably criticizing somebody for something and they happen to be Christian. So yes, I'm criticizing a Christian, but I'm not criticizing a Christian for being a Christian. So I have, I don't know if I've published too many response videos to Muslims. I did a response video to a Muslim that I have to put up at some point. And, I have no problem criticizing both religions. But I do know that there are a lot of people who are like, well, you're Islamophobic if you criticize Islam. And, that's not necessarily the case because Islamophobia is more about hating Muslims instead of the religion of Islam.
This is something I've always found fascinating, that you'll read atheistic bloggers. They'll talk about how Christians want to take over this country. They want to force people to abide by the Old Testament laws. And there will be all, you think about Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, that if Christians somehow took over, they would enslave women and do all of these horrible.
Oh, The Handmaid's Tale. That's a fictional story, and, while it may be, based on some fears about what might happen, you also got to just realize, people put these things out for entertainment.
Things. And all of these examples live in their imaginations, that they have not happened and they're nowhere near happening. Most Christians just don't want to be involved with evil. We don't want to be involved in a same-sex wedding. There's plenty of...
Did you just call same-sex weddings evil? It's a fucking wedding, dude.
Businesses that will be involved. We just don't want to be involved in that, or abortion, or pornography. Just leave us alone in that regard. So I've noticed that there'll be all this criticism about Christianity as if it's trying to take away everybody's rights. And then radio silence on Islam, where actually the closest thing to The Handmaid's Tale would be how women are treated in Muslim countries.
I do frequently call out, the human rights violations in the Middle East with, women not being allowed to go to school, get educated, blah, blah, blah. And, I call out misogyny no matter who's doing it, and I personally do have an issue with, some of the things that Muslims are doing to each other and to other people.
where women cannot go outside without a male chaperone, aren't allowed to drive a car, aren't allowed to go to school. Even in very Christian subcultures in the United States, you don't have anything like that. And it's just amazing to me that there are atheists who will say Christianity is the greatest threat to human rights, to women, and completely ignore Islam in that regard.
I agree that's a problem.
There was a panel a few years ago at Georgetown University where he's a humanist, Phil Zuckerman. He's not religious, a humanist. I don't know if he calls himself an atheist, but he's a humanist, believes in the value of human beings apart from God. Was with Kirsten Powers and I think Russell Moore, who's a Christian. And he was talking, and they were talking about how, atheists will criticize Christians, but they criticize Islam. And in many cases, the reason is that they're afraid to criticize Islam because they know they could be threatened with violence. But they can criticize Christians all day long because Christians, except for a few radical examples, Christians by and large are nonviolent.
Muslims by and large are nonviolent. We tend to notice more when Muslims are violent, but most Muslims aren't going to act violently just because you criticize their religion. It is really just those, extremist few that are more visible than the extremist Christians. I don't know who's actually more common when it comes to the numbers, but I would agree that, you're not necessarily in any danger of physical violence just for criticizing religion, unless you are in an area the Middle East where, it is actually a crime and you can get killed for criticizing religion. But, here in the States, you generally don't have to worry too much about, doing more than pissing somebody off and they, getting mad at you. You're not going to be, victimized, generally speaking.
When people say incredibly offensive things to them. So here's the clip.
I absolutely agree that it is okay for those on the left to critique, mock, deride Christianity, but Islam gets a free pass, which is so strange, because if you care about women's rights, if you care about human rights, if you care about gay rights, then Islam is much more problematic. Sorry to paint Islam with a huge brush, and much more devastating. As an atheist, where on planet Earth is the death penalty meted out to atheists? Right. It's only in, I think, 24 Muslim countries. Where have...
I will say that there are Christian dominionists who have similar beliefs about how we should treat non-believers, and they range from we need to forcefully convert them to we need to exile them to we need to execute them, and of course these things haven't actually been enacted in law, partially because there just hasn't been somebody pushing that kind of legislation. But the fact of the matter is that there are people from both religions who want to see harm done to people who don't believe in their religions. It's just that the Muslims are the ones that are actually enacting it. And so, again, action versus belief, yes. I think we still need to be, free to criticize, kind of anything.
Human rights flourish the most in Christian nations. Where is tolerance the greatest in nations rooted in Christianity? So when I look, I see Christianity as a great friend to secular culture. And I see Islam as much more of a threat, much more debilitating, I'm not talking about Muslim individuals that I happen to sit next to on an airplane or are my neighbors. I'm talking about the doctrines and those with the power to enforce those doctrines in the form of Sharia law. So I agree with you. So the question you're asking, though, is why? Because this was the Bill Maher, Ben Affleck, Sam Harris kerfuffle as well. And I would say two things. I know what keeps me from critiquing Islam on my blogs is just fear. I've got 3 kids, so I know that I can say anything about Christianity or Mormonism, and I'm not living in fear, which is a testament to Christianity and Mormon. That's wonderful. Thank you. That you're not gonna. I can write on my blog all kinds of things.
If you'd like more on this subject, by the way, I definitely recommend Liberty in the Things of God, the Christian Origins of Religious Freedom. And Wilkin does a great job of showing how Christianity has promoted the natural right to religious freedom since the time of the apostles. In fact, it was the ecclesial writer Tertullian who first used the phrase freedom of religion, actually. So definitely go and check that out. So to summarize the 5 double standards, we have the ancient document double standard. We have saying that God is evil, but also saying there's no such thing as evil. Bad Christians are evidence against atheism, but bad atheists don't prove anything. Ridiculing how Christians censor others, but censoring and excommunicating other atheists you disagree with. And then criticizing Christians while not criticizing Islam for doing similar things or for actually engaging in human rights violations. So I hope that's helpful for you all. And yeah, I just hope you have a very blessed day.
All right. So that was Trent Horn, and I hope y'all enjoyed. I was very glad that he didn't say that every atheist uses these double standard arguments. I agree that a lot of them are problematic, especially about the ancient document problem, as well as not attacking Muslims. Well, I shouldn't say attacking. Nobody should be attacking each other, but I do want to say that a lot of the apologist videos that I come across, Muslim and Christian, but particularly Muslim, are just utter garbage and not worth responding to. But there were a couple of Muslim apologists that I did make some response videos to that you guys will be seeing in the coming weeks. So with that, I've been pedantic, far away from the Atlantic, and somewhat romantic, and I hope everybody has a great day.